Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I replace the front wheel brake pads and the rotors on my Jeep Patriot. First, I park the vehicle on a level floor with the transmission shifter in park position. The parking brake was also engaged. Then I use my breaker bar with a 19mm socket to loosen the front wheel's lug nuts. Before lifting the front of the vehicle with the floor jacks, I secured the rear wheels with 4-wheel chocks. Later, when the front was jacked up, I added 2 jack stands to improve the safety. As you can see, the rotors were rusted out. Because of the cold conditions during the long winters in Canada and north of the United States, a lot of road salt is used on the streets to melt down the snow and the ice. Consequently, the salt mixed with snow and water causes a lot of rust under the vehicles. Since the front of the vehicle was lifted, I have been able to position each rotor to be able to work and film without big problems. Most of the time, when I'm working, I use penetrating oil on rusted bolts. To work on my front brakes, I prepare different sizes of ratchets to undo the bolts. I also had a 14mm socket for the caliper bolts and a short 18mm socket for the caliper bracket bolts. Note, the procedure shown in this presentation was done on the left-hand side of the vehicle. At first, I used the long ratchet to loosen the 2 guide pin bolts, then it was easy to unscrew them with a small ratchet. When the threaded portion of each guide pin bolt was completely unscrewed, the rest of the pins were pulled out completely. If a caliper is too tight to be removed, the piston can be retracted by pulling the caliper towards the outboard direction until it gets loose enough to be removed. This one was not too tight, so I only needed to wiggle it and get it out by hand. When the caliper was disengaged, I hanged it on the strut with my hassock hanger to protect the brake hose. Next, it was time to remove the brake pads and the caliper bracket. Because the brake pads were stuck in the caliper bracket, I decided to remove the bracket with the brake pads still on. Sometimes the bracket bolts can be difficult to undo, so I use a breaker bar or a long ratchet to loosen them. With my ratchet, I needed an extension and a short 18mm socket to have enough clearance to undo the upper bolt. Soon after, I tried to remove the rotor by hand, but it was stuck on the hub. Once again, I sprayed some penetrating oil from behind the rotor and around the stud to ease the work. While the oil was penetrating between the hub and the rotor, I secured the caliper bracket in the bench vise. Working this way was very convenient to remove the old brake pads and the pad clips. As you can see, there was a lot of rust built up behind the clips. If the pads and the clips are replaced without removing this rust, the pads will be tight and it will create break-in problems. In general, I use a wire brush and a metal file to remove the rust and clean the tab contact surfaces on the caliper brackets. Sometimes I also have to remove the rust built up inside the bracket to prevent any risk of rubbing on the rotor. While the caliper bracket was held in the vise, it was a good time to lubricate the guide pin bolts and the guide pin cavities. It is important to use silicone brake lubricant to avoid damaging the guide pin boots and the bushing on the upper guide pin. The guide pins must slide easily to properly guide the calipers. Usually, I apply a thin coat of brake lubricant on the contact surfaces of the caliper bracket to slow down the rust process. Then, I check if the clips and the brake pads are fitting without restriction. If after that a brake pad is still too tight to move properly, sometimes a better deburring of the metal tabs can be done with a metal file or a bench grinder. Next, I went back under the vehicle to remove the stuck rotor. By using 2 hammers, it gave me enough impact to whack with precision on the inside recess of the rotor. This procedure is also very useful when I want to reuse the rotor without damaging the surface of the disc. Before degreasing the new rotors, I double-checked if they were matching with the old ones. Note, when using brake cleaner, make sure to follow the written directions. My new rotors had a coat of greasy wax on both sides and I degreased them as required. Prior to installing each new rotor, I cleaned the hub and I applied a coat of anti-seize. Soon after, I wiped off the excess compound on the studs to properly apply the torque to the wheel lug nuts. As shown, I also added a bit of anti-seize inside the rotor. The new rotor was put in place, and to keep it well seated on the hub during the time of the caliper installation, I used 2 lug nuts. Then I refitted the caliper bracket. I fastened the 2 bracket bolts and I set the torque to 80 foot-pounds. When an inner brake pad is installed in front of the wheel axle shaft, the pad wear indicator should be located in the upper position to match the leading edge of the brake pad. Any brake lubricant or anti-seize that could end up between the brake pads and the rotor disc must be wiped off. Before retracting any caliper piston, the cap of the brake fluid reservoir must be removed to be able to check the brake fluid. The fluid level must always be kept between add and full during the piston retracting procedure and the brake pedal pumping procedure. To be able to have enough space to install the caliper with the new pads, the piston must be slowly and fully retracted. If there's too much brake fluid in the reservoir, it can be siphoned off as needed. When the piston was seated, the caliper was refitted in place. During the positioning, I made sure to protect the guide pin boots to avoid damaging them. As soon as the caliper was well aligned with the caliper bracket, I inserted the guide pin bolt with the bushing in the upper position and then the second one without bushing in the lower position. The guide pin bolts were fastened and later the torque was set to 32 foot-pounds. After, I slowly pumped the brake pedal several times until I felt the pads were seated on the rotor. When the work was completed on both sides of the vehicle, the wheels were reinstalled. Soon after, the vehicle was lowered on the floor and the lug nut torque was set to 100 foot-pounds. Before the road test, I pumped the brake pedal again for safety. The brake fluid level was also checked again and the lid was put back on. During the road test, the brakes performed quite well on the road and they were fine even in the snow. After the road test, I checked if the rotors were overheating. They were not, so it confirmed the moving parts were not seized up.